I enjoyed a quickening conversation with poet Rachel McCrum, and I have to say I love this word quickening. She uses the word quickening. I never heard it before. I'm going to have to use it more often. I really like it. So I spoke with Rachel about interpreting the crafts of writing and painting, poetry as a space of ambiguity and uncertainty, and burnout. She shares a beautiful line from Inua Ellams, "Poetry is the cheapest way to be free." That really struck a chord with me. And take note that the podcast she references is the Blindboy Podcast by Limerick-born musician and author David Chambers, also known as Blindboy Boatclub. Here's my conversation with Rachel. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. We're back in Montreal. So when we spoke last week, which was when we were originally supposed to do the podcast, I was out in Bas-Saint-Laurent. We bought a house in a place called Kakuna last year, which is outside Rivière-du-Loup, which is gorgeous and sort of facing the river. And we're in the process of setting up writer residencies out there. We got it going quite quickly, which I think has contributed to other states of mind, which we'll get to. We bought it last July, so it's not even been a year, and we have about 20 writers coming in over the summer. Yeah, so but it's been interesting. It's it's the most wonderful place, but we're still half time in Montreal. The work is still here. My partner's daughter is still here. She's half with us, half with her mum. She's a delight, but it's another responsibility. So we're kind of getting used to a new rhythm. And that's been interesting. That's had some impacts, I think.
You mentioned burnout. That stood out to me in your message back. So we will, if you're still up for that, we will definitely touch on that.
Oh,
We can
yeah.
talk about that a bit. And I will commiserate with you because I do know a little bit how that feels. So
definitely, it's an interesting one, and yeah, I definitely would like to see the conversation opened up about it a bit more, I think.
Absolutely. But we're going to start nice and gentle. We're going to start with what got you writing poetry?
So I grew up in Northern Ireland, is the accent. So I was County Down, which is the bit of Northern Ireland that faces Scotland. And I was a bookish kid, if that's not old fashioned, but I loved books. I loved words. My brother's musical. I'm not. Neither of us have any capacity for visual art whatsoever, but words and the ability of words and language to create imaginary worlds, I think, was something as a child and as an adolescent, really resonated with me and has continued now. I'm 42 now. And it's funny, your questions came at a really welcome time because I think I hadn't reflected on all this for a while. And I was thinking about it. I was thinking, what is this strand with words and language? And there's things for me. I think language is my way of interpreting the world and communicating myself back out to it. And that's always a strange one with poetry and writing in any form because it's the everyday expression in so many ways. But actually to be able to take such a deeper in that, words and well-constructed words and well-constructed phrases and beautiful phrases, I find it quickening. I find it more exciting, I think, than anything else. And when I started to write myself, as in write by myself, but also in a way write myself, I think, I found it gave me a clarity in being able to present myself and interpret what I thought about the world back out. I have a bit of a magpie brain, and in speech can be quite scattered. And so there was structuring there, and just a joy. It's really a thing that brings me joy at the heart of it. I find it difficult. Don't get me wrong. I'm very slow, but it's a profound joy.
I find that so interesting about poetry because I spoke to another poet a little while back. His name was Stefan, and so he said something similar to you, which is it's a way of capturing and expressing back something about your everyday experience. It's what you're thinking and feeling in this moment. And on the flip side, it's a heck of a lot of work to get the right words in the right order, in the right structure. So it's deceptive in a way because it's not a straightforward process to get to something that is so direct in terms of expressing experience.
I think absolutely. And because we do use speech and language and words every day over and over again, whether, reading, writing emails, to find a way to do that differently, find a way to go, no, there's something else I'm trying to get at. Listen to other poets, or you read other poets. Emily Dickinson's famous one is tell all the truth, but tell it slant. And finding, first of all the truth and then the façon to tell it slant is tricky. But it's so satisfying when you get there.
I've come late to poetry, so I've been afraid of poetry for decades and really thought this is not for me. And only recently have I just dipped like a tiny, tiny toe. And mostly it's just about trying to talk myself into being open to feeling it's not a scary place to go. It's okay. And whatever I get is what I get. And that's fine.
Yeah. And it's vast. I mean, it's a huge, like any world of art. I mean, visual art's my equivalent there. I'm quite scared of visual art, in all honesty, because I don't understand it and I don't understand how to interpret it. And funnily enough, we've just had a really brilliant exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Montreal. It's been a Georgia O'Keeffe and Henry Moore. And, I knew a bit of their work, but there's a really brilliant biography of Georgia O'Keeffe, but I think it's Roxana Roxburgh. I might have to look that up. But it's a book that I read years ago, and I don't know if you know it, but it's simultaneously a biography of an incredibly interesting life, and it details her starting with Stieglitz, who was such a pioneer of photography. And when you think about the influence of photography in O'Keeffe's work and aperture and perspective and light, and then her own independence in going out. I had a brilliant interview with her at the Musée des Beaux-Arts, and she's such an imp. But the book was so generously written in terms of opening up how to interpret her paintings and what to look for in terms of the structure and the craft. And you suddenly go, oh, I can apply this to other paintings. And so, just that, finding that key that opens it up to you to go, not necessarily the meaning, but the craft that's been applied, I think, is incredibly valuable in making those worlds less scary.
What I can relate to in that is using words to gain access into visual art, which is what I do. I'm one of those people who goes to the museum and reads the little thing beside every single picture. So I'm like, what am I supposed to be looking for? Okay, now I'm going to look for that. Yeah. Whereas there's a whole bunch of other more visually oriented people who go to the images. They ignore. A lot of them don't even look at the written piece, but I can definitely relate to, please just talk to me, or I'll read about how to try to understand it, and then I'll go and try.
Which is giving it, the richness. It's opening it up for you. It's unlocking it. And once I think that door's prized open even a little bit, it's much easier to push it open for other artists. So yeah, no, I get it.
What would you say are some of the themes that you explore through the poetry you write?
Yeah, again, your questions came at a really interesting time because I'm actually reflecting on that at the minute, because my first book came out in 2017 in Scotland. It was republished in a bilingual edition in 2021 in Montreal. But it's been a while, and I've done other bits and pieces of projects, but I think I've been wondering, what am I writing about these days? What is the thing that is getting my attention? And so the first book, which is very much a first book, it's an amalgam of every poem I'd tried and everything that had caught my attention since I'd started writing again in my mid-30s. But there was definitely a theme of, at that time, I'd moved from Northern Ireland to Scotland. So this was like, around 2015, 2016. The talk of the world was a lot about immigration and migration. We were seeing a lot of boats crossing the Mediterranean, refugees fleeing from Syria, particularly, also Yemen and Afghanistan and all that. there was a wider political picture I was trying to get my head around and trying to engage with. And then, at a very self-absorbed, subjunctive façon, which is, what we do, I think, or certainly what I do, was going for echoes in terms of, I'd moved from Northern Ireland when I was 18. I'd never really felt that I'd settled. Obviously, it was not the same situation as what was happening there, but it was that idea of what's movement, what's immigration, what is it to move from country to country. So there's that idea of going the lived experience, but also looking at the wider world and going, can I find an access here, a resonance to explore something bigger? And so there was a lot in it about moving and immigration. And also my dad's a sailor and I grew up sailing. So even this idea of water and boats and, there's a physicality there that I could understand. So lived experience, but then looking at the wider political picture. I'm interested by poetry that's politically engaged. It has to be this world. And so then I moved over to Quebec in 2017. Took me a while to get grounded and go, what the heck? But one of the big changes in my life was I became a stepmother to a very cool, complicated, self-aware 9-year-old as she was then. She's now 17. And actually became one of the big challenges of living here, in addition to, living bilingually and living 3,000 kilometers away from home and all the rest. But this idea of step parenting really got me. So the most recent work has been looking at, there was actually a text written last year called The Stepmother, La Belle-Mère, which is going to be a show this year. So we're in the middle of rehearsals for that. And it's coming out as a book bilingually as well. So, but what we looked at there was, it was this idea of, it's my and co-writing partner, Amélie Prévost, and she's also a stepmother to a teenage girl. Neither of us have biological children of our own, nor will we. So there was a very specific set of circumstances, but we were interested in exploring the archetype of step-parents and stepmothers, and also going, if we were to interview other stepmothers, stepfathers, stepchildren, can we find common links and differences in the experience, taking again that very sort of personal lived experience and going, how can we try and explore something wider and more political, because step parenting is political. It's hugely underexplored. In Canada, is a huge percentage of step parents, also largely in Quebec.
So if I try and think about what counts as everyday experience, so if you think the first part around what it means to move, and you were looking at that within the context of refugees fleeing in maybe a different kind of a context, but that feeling of having to leave your home, and then step parenting also, I sort of feel like poetry still even abstracts out from that. So even if I'm not a step parent, I can read poetry about being a step parent and I can connect that to something else in my life. I don't know. There's something about poetry that just seems like it's like an arrow that goes straight in. And so I have lived in Montreal pretty much all my life. I feel like I could read your poetry about moving and I can connect that in some way to my life, even though I haven't gone anywhere. Is that fair? Or is that just me trying to make poetry the whole thing?
No, I think it's very fair. It's funny. I was teaching a course on loosely political poetry this spring, which was really enlightening in lots of ways. I've been doing a lot of teaching this spring and it's a joy. And this one in particular, we were looking at kind of the role of the political poet. One of the things that came up, although it is to be debated and it's in itself uncertain, was this idea of the poet and poetry within all the forms of sort of rhetoric and discourse as being the place where ambiguity and to a degree uncertainty can exist, because there is always going to be ambiguity of language and interpretation between the intent of the poet and what the reader brings to it. Words, images, resonances, metaphors will have different associations for all of us. And so I think that ability to read a poem and find resonance in it has to do with, we all carry our own internal dictionaries, thesauruses, associations. Language is personal to all of us. And so we can write with an intent, but you have to let it go and know that it will be received in different ways. And that has to be the act of generosity, I think, of writing and poetry, because it's obscure. You know, there is the deliberate vagueness to it at times, gives that space for the reader to enter into it and construct their own meaning, I think.
That's interesting, because different people that I've spoken with who work in different fields have said something similar, which is also part of, once you let your work, once it's done and you let it out, then it becomes something to each person who encounters it that may have nothing or not a lot to do with what you thought you intended when you, so you have to let the intention go. You create the pieces, you let them out, and people will make of them what they will based on how they approach them and their own life experiences and interests and things.
And what mood they're in when they read it. And, you know, are they hungry? Are they tired? Are they angry? Are they fed up? Are they in need of solace? Are they in need of energy? You know, what age are they? As a good teenage girl interested in poetry, obviously got into Sylvia Plath at an early age. But I've read Plath at 17. My copy of her works was a birthday present from Sophie Orr, one of my best mates at school, because I've still got the inscription. And I've read that Faber book at 17. I read it at 30. I've read it at 40, which is older than Plath was when she died, which is in a changing world. And those poems change, you know, because we change.
I'm in awe. I really am. There's something about poetry and people who write poetry. I just think it's an unbelievably expressive medium. I feel like you could do, it's almost like clay. Like literally make anything out of clay. You can make anything out of words, and poetry seems to let go a lot of the restrictions you have with other forms of writing. And you can make anything out of words.
And that's where the joy comes in, right? That's where the freedom comes into it. Inua Ellams, who's a really great UK Nigerian poet, has a line that poetry is the cheapest way to be free, because, you know, you don't need a lot of materials. You don't need your studio. You need to read, I think, and you need to know your own language and your own tongue and how you use words and have the confidence then to play with it. There is a craft there, I think. There is a craft there in knowing how you're playing with words and sound and rhythm. But you just need time and space. That's the other thing. That's the difficult thing to carve out, I think, you know. And then it's the play. And as I say, that's the joy of it, and the freedom and the flow and the quickening and all those other words.
So I might hop on the needing the space and the time, and maybe also the frame of mind, to ask you, because when we spoke about talking today, you raised as a possible subject to talk about burnout or recent experiences of maybe overwhelm. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe I can just invite you to speak about that.
Yeah, you caught me at a really interesting time. So we'd spoken last week, changed to the next week. I was aware, I knew rationally what was happening after a period of being quite irrational, to be honest. But I was like, no, I'm burning out. And then in the intervening week, I came back to Montreal, and my body did something which it's actually done a few times in the past. It's actually done since I was young, when I get really stressed or overloaded, which is just get really ill for about 48 hours.
Oh, no.
And my stomach literally cramps up. And sorry for it to be graphic, but I throw up quite violently for about 24 hours. And my whole system shuts down. And to me, that's like, right, you've reached your peak. Your body is fed up. It is literally telling you to stop. There's a word I really like in French. It's like fragilise, like to make fragile. Like, I'm going to make you fragile to the point where you have to stop and just be exhausted, and then very gently build yourself back up again. And so that's exactly what it did in the last week, which isn't great, but it sort of makes me laugh, because I'm like, yes, it's obviously telling me what to do. And so, I mean, what had happened was, you know, it's a sort of a symptom of the freelance life. And in a way, I'm incredibly lucky, because I've been able to create and build a career structure for myself that is freelance, you know, and I make my living with very busy periods, and in the hope that there will then be periods where I have less to do because I've literally banked enough money to keep me going, where I can write and I can take time for it. But I will bring up the pandemic. There was a long period where we were not able to future plan. It was, for freelancers, and I'm sure you know this, it was a question of saying yes to absolutely everything that came across the desk because we didn't know where the next contract was going to come from, as it was for so many people. And so that period of rest and respite hasn't really happened for the last few years, I would say. But in this year, I knew the summer was coming up. And so I piled so much work into mid-March till really mid-May. And I met you for the first time at a workshop. I just checked the date. It was the 23rd of March. I actually thought it was mid-April. But the period has been such a blur. That's how fast it went. And I mean, that workshop, I think, was the 8th in a run of like 11 different poetry workshops in 14 days. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but they're all different. And it's all different groups of people. It's all different topics. There's no time to process anything that had happened between one and the other. And like, there's part of me is going like, world's smallest violin here, McCrum. This is not hard. But it was exhausting. And that pace kept up for 2 months. And I burnt out. And what was interesting for me this time was I'm a big fan of a podcast called Blindboy. I don't know if you know it.
No.
Okay, so he's brilliant. He started off, he's from Limerick in Ireland. He wears a plastic bag in his head with holes cut for the eyes and mouth. He was part of a amazing sort of punk, I don't even know what you'd call them, art school rap group called the Rubber Bandits, who have such classic songs as I've Got a Horse Outside and Your Dad's Best Friend and other things. They're amazing. I suggest you look them up. And then he started this really interesting podcast in the last few years, which has gone huge. Like he's got millions of listeners. And he talks a lot about mental health and he talks a lot about creative life. And he had done a big tour. And he was talking about burnout, and he was specifically talking about autistic burnout because he's had a diagnosis of autism, but he was talking about burnout in general. And he does this thing where he researches everything incredibly carefully, and then he lists the symptoms. And I've been doing all this driving between Montreal and Cacouna, and I was listening to this and I was just like going, oh, okay. So, bad decision making, loss of sort of executive function in terms of doing simple things, total inability to maintain proper social contact. And in my case, becoming a horrible person. I get really irritable and really up. And then I feel incredibly disappointed in myself. And then I feel like I'm failing. And then it either goes into more bad decision making, or it goes into destructive behavior, and it's a few more drinks in the evening. And then you just spiral. And really getting into that feeling of just complete and utter depletion, coupled with a bit of emptiness, coupled with just feeling of what the hell, it spirals down and down. And I did a bit of research before from depression. It's seen as, it is a condition of work essentially and feeling lack of control, but it is seen as a gateway to depression or ways to manage an interesting period. My is also freelance, has put up with some very odd behavior from me in the last while. All while, I'm getting up and going to work and being as professional as possible and holding space for groups of strangers to sit down and write and explore personal, authentic and, positive poetry and all the rest of it. So yeah, the dichotomy of that becomes hard to sustain as well.
For a living, what I do, so I work freelance and I have done my whole life. But specifically, I develop workshops at corporate, so for employees to learn whatever skills they need to do their job. This is the second cat, so now I've got 2 now on the desk.
Brilliant.
Really just need number 3 to come along, and we'll have a full house here.
I love it.
They're like, hey, we want in. And so I actually do have some sight into how much it takes to facilitate workshops with people and what it takes to in that space and hold that space for other people to explore. And in poetry, it's a little more serious than how to hold the knife to be able to cut the box open to do this part of your job. That's not quite as emotionally investing as people writing poetry, because they're starting to explore deeper feelings, accessing the world, and you're facilitating that. So I actually think that's an incredibly, I want to say draining, because it makes it sound not as empowering and wonderful as I'm sure it is, but to do a whole series of those in a row on the tail, like as we're approaching the tail end of a burnout, I can't even imagine how exhausting that would be.
Yeah, no, it is exactly that. And I love teaching. I absolutely adore it. And there's been so many moments, if I could remember them, but in all honesty, a lot of them have run into each other. And I feel like I need to sit down with my diary and go, right, what was that workshop? Who was in that? What did I learn from that workshop? What came out from that? Because it's wonderful. It's the biggest privilege in the world to be able to hold that space, as you say, exactly, and open that space for people. It forces me to sharpen up my thinking and my communication and my research and my imagination and to hold play. And, I get to work with these people who are trusting this space to explore and to play for themselves and to be vulnerable within that space. I will say, and to feel like you're going through the motions, and that as a facilitator you're not able to be fully present for that is actually really it's devastating, because you start to feel like a fraud. I mean, in a way, I'm lucky in that I've been teaching. Well, it's not going to sound like that long, 10 years. Berg, I don't know if you've come across her. She's a vocal coach. She's very well known in the UK. In her 70s now, I think. She talks a lot about craft and being present. She's really big on how to be present in a situation. And she talks about like circles of presence. Really, really interesting.
Well, I must have been oblivious, because I attended your workshop and I thought you were fully present and I loved it. And I didn't see any sign of burning out, nothing. I mean, so I don't know where I was. Clearly I was not present. I don't know.
Oh, no. I loved that. Was a brilliant workshop. I had such fun at that one, because it was an all-day workshop on mapping and creative mapping and in the imaginary, which is a new area I'm starting to explore. And this is it. This is part of the fun of it. Once you're in there and you're going, okay, like, let's try and encourage people in this direction. And then people bring their own energy to workshops as well. I mean, it's definitely a two-way street, teaching creatively.
Take a step back, because there's something interesting about what it means to be present. And I might read too much into this, but I'm sort of trying to balance that. You are present as a facilitator, you're being present for the people who are in your workshop. So you're creating a space, welcoming, it's safe, it's encouraging and empowering. And I'm balancing that with what you said earlier about how you got to the point where your body finally had to say, oh, no, Rachel, I'm actually going to stop you, because you're not stopping yourself. And so I'm going to say it like this, it's not coming out the right way, but there was, in a sense, a lack of presence for you, because if you're present for you, then you say, before your body has a chance to completely fragilize itself, you say, I'm stopping. And so I'm just wondering, like, in a space to be able to write poetry, which is very different from facilitating workshops, that I'm assuming requires that presence for you.
It's a really astute question, and it's a very generous question. So thank you for that. It is 100% about being able to be present with the poem, to be present for yourself, but in the relationship with the poem or whatever it is that you're trying to write, to the exclusion of everything else, which can feel selfish, which is difficult to do, to give yourself time for that, to give value to that, I think. But it's also very freeing. That's part of the liberty and the joy of it. Going, nothing else matters right now, Future anxiety, nope. Past regrets and shame and guilt and whatever else you're dwelling on, nope. What matters is the moment right now, and being able to put your whole body and mind and spirit into that moment.
To learn more about Rachel and her work, you can explore Rachel McCrum poetperformer.wordpress.com online and at kicking.paris on Instagram. For sight into another aspect of Rachel's artistic practice, Check out her vocals as a member of poetry noise bog rock band Pigs and Wolves. Their EP, The Unfortunate Waggle, is due out late October 2024.